brand needs a rebrand because like it's such an eye roll word, right? And it sounds so expensive and mysterious. But I think in a world where creating software and writing code and building businesses is easier than ever, it feels like brand is really the biggest moat that you could possibly have. And so that's my hyper main focus. And I had someone ask me yesterday, like, oh, are you more of an analytical marketer or more of a creative marketer? And historically, I was very analytical, data-driven. All I cared about was the numbers and pipeline. But now I feel like I've flipped almost to the other side where it feels like the brand is more important than ever. And it needs to have like that soul and personality. And I think I've also grown as a marketing leader where it takes a lot of confidence to build brand because it's so squishy and based on taste.
Hello and welcome to Best Story Wins. I'm your host, Josh, and I'm here with my co-host, Jason. And today our guest is Sylvia LePoidevin. Hey, Sylvia. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Hey, Sylvia.
Yeah, so Sylvia, for people that might not be familiar with you, can you give an overview of who you are and what you've been working on for the last couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been very early stage at startups my whole career, like first marketing hire, like we got nothing starting early stage. Most recently, I was the CMO at Kanji, which they just rebranded to Iru. So it's a different name, but I was there for the last more than 6 years. So was employee number 4 and helped grow the marketing team, function, brand, absolutely everything from the ground floor. So that was an incredible ride. So we're up to 300 employees or something now, but ready to go back to early stage and do the whole thing again. People think I'm crazy, but I love it.
That's really cool. And so you grew up in Africa, chasing after giraffes and living definitely a different childhood than most tech leaders in the US. How did that overall shape your approach to work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think if I could put it in a word, it'd be resilience and the ability to kind of like jump off the cliff and take the risk. Like we lived in the middle of nowhere. We had nothing. We were around people that had less than nothing. And so I think, I see the opportunity in front of me. I see how lucky I am to be here and everything that I have that the people I grew up around didn't have. And it just makes me want to take the leap and do the thing and, bounce back if something fails. Like there's just a gratitude and a sense of purpose and a sense of just, wanting to take the opportunity that was given to me. So I would say like a lot of people learn resilience in startups, but I learned it chasing giraffes in Africa.
That's awesome. So you were at Kanji for quite a while, 6+ years, building that company. I think you said you're employee number 4. Why the pull and why the pull now back to early stage? Is there something special about like that type of company that you really want to re-examine, or can you share a little bit about the decision to do something new?
Yeah, it's funny when I joined Condi employee number 4, all my colleagues at the time were like, "Are you a glutton for punishment? Like, why are you doing this?" And so I think I've always been drawn to that early stage. One of the first startups I ever joined was a company called Flowcast. They're based in LA. I was the first marketing hire there. Very early in my career, I was probably 22, 23 when I started there, highly unqualified for the job. No idea why they hired me, but that company's now worth 1.6 billion. They're looking to IPO. And so I think that really solidified for me that experience of like creating something from nothing and being able to point at something and be like, I built that, I created that. And just that blank slate, like it's like a blank sheet of paper, and you can fold that sheet of paper into any shape or look and feel that you want. And so I just find a lot of meaning, a lot of purpose. I just enjoy that journey a lot. But now why I want to go back to early stage is a little bit different. I think the way that AI native companies are building and creating today is so different from the past. And so I want to experience that. I want to have that blank slate opportunity to build something from scratch in a different way than perhaps I did it in the past. So on the one hand, I've done this many times before. On the other hand, it's going to be completely different.
That's so cool. So you've said you want to build in an AI native way. What does that actually mean for how teams operate today?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, You'll have teams that are leaner that are able to do more. I don't think it's necessarily that companies are going to have less employees per se, but I think that team is going to be able to produce and do more creative work than they've done in the past. And the way that I think about building teams right now in this era, so to speak, is I was experimenting with this on my team at Condi as well. Like, people will kind of gravitate into one of two roles, and I call them the tastemakers and the operators. And so there's the folks that the tastemakers are like, maybe they went to journalism or film school and they love creating and they love quality and they have good taste. And then the operators are the folks that just love building and constructing and weaving tools together and building automations. They probably have like a smart home, at home, or automate their personal life with Zapier or whatever. And so I think when you could kind of pair those two people together, or those two skill sets together, some folks do have both, then I think you can create something really special. But I think both are really important. I don't think it's just about automating everything away, if that makes sense. I think it's a lot more about automating the things that open up some more spaces for creativity. Because I think the big mistake I see a lot of companies making is they're obsessed with automating. And I was talking to a CMO recently who was like, we went from publishing 2 blogs a month to 5 or something like that. And I was like, but why? and what's different and what's unique about that? Like, I think a lot of folks are just kind of like in hyper production mode and trying to ship a lot more quantity and not really thinking about the buyer, or not really thinking about how they're going to do things differently, not really thinking about how they can create value for the people that they're serving and creating for. So I think it's very kind of this self-centered view of like, let's just automate everything and produce. But like, I don't think everyone's doing that. That's just commoditized now. And I think you have to do something really unique and different to stand out. And that's going to require that like tastemaker creativity mind that can be like, all right, what's something different or something unique that we can create in this world that's going to mean something? Because I think that, the barrier to entry to just producing lots of stuff is going to go down, and then it's not going to be worth much.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of at a point right now where there isn't really a barrier to entry. The cost of production is pretty much zero. It's an interesting time to be in content marketing, and in particular B2B marketing, just because so much has changed in the last couple of years in terms of the playbooks that used to work, they don't work anymore. And with the cost of production being basically zero, there's just more to kind of wade through. And that old, as you mentioned, like that old idea of like, well, let's just produce more content, like it doesn't work anymore. I'm curious to understand, like, kind of with that said, and with what you just shared, like, what's something else that you see in like the world of B2B marketing that you think people treat as gospel that's just completely wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one thing that comes to mind is I think a lot of folks are focused on creating content in general, focused on creating content that's relevant to their audience, or content that's helpful. And I think helpful content is not going to cut it anymore. I think the content that's going to work has to be from a person. And it has to be like, here's this, I'm going to start by telling you a story, and I'm going to take you on this journey with me. And like, those are the types of things AI can't replicate. Like, AI can write the helpful guide. It can write 100 of them. It can write 1,000 of them. But nobody can take that personal story and share that with the world. It doesn't have that. And so if I could give any B2B marketing team like one piece of advice, it would be like, never ever publish anything else from the team. Like, everything should have a person's name on it, and everything should have as woven into that some personal experience or story or something that's going to connect in a human way. I think that in the future is what's going to stand out from all of the AI generated content out there.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. So let's talk a little bit about the sequence, the content series we produced and as a team. And I'm curious what the original thesis was there, and when you realized it had become a true content brand.
Yeah, I love this story. I there was a few reasons why we created it, and then some of the impact that it had was actually very different than we anticipated. The reason why we created it is because we wanted to create something people would actually follow. And we felt like the company blog was just not good enough anymore. The helpful content was not good enough anymore. And so we wanted to create a content brand that folks would actually follow, subscribe to, like something that was that valuable that could have a following. And we didn't feel like it being housed under the sort of corporate brand was going to cut it. So we created this like sub brand, this content brand. And it was a fun exercise because we got to have some more creative liberties than I think we could have had if it was under the sort of corporate brand. Like it had even like a different look and feel, and it had contributors. It was almost like a journalism site where we had several contributors internally from the company. And we did have a vision to extend that to external contributors in the future as well. But again, like all the human stories, everything was from a person. And yeah, that was the idea. It was like, let's create something that's so valuable people will actually follow and subscribe. Something that I really believe in is this concept of building for the 95%. So like 5% of your buyers are in market at any given time and 95% are not. And I think at Kanji, I mean, I was there many years. I wish I would have started really taking seriously the 95% much sooner, because I think we were definitely behind the ball on that, because it's tempting, right? Like you want to generate pipeline growth. And so it's easy to focus on that 5%, but eventually you're going to kind of hit this ceiling with that group. And I think speaking to the 95% is so important to get that like scale and efficiency that you want in the future. And so that was kind of the premise behind it. Can we reach the 95%, and can we do it with something that folks will actually follow and subscribe to, that's human driven by internal contributors? But then the impact it had was that one surprising thing was that it actually ended up being very positive for LLM search optimization. I don't know if we've chosen an acronym for that yet, if it's AEO or GEO or whatever, LLMO, but it ended up being very valuable for that. And we would notice that when we were searching in LLMs for kanji, the sequence would be cited very heavily. And my hypothesis, and this whole world is changing so quickly, so who knows where this will go in the future, right? But my hypothesis was that the LLMs are looking for, external third-party sources as well as the first-party sources of data when they're, being asked about a certain company. And so I think the LLMs were treating the sequence as a third-party source because it was on its own domain. So it was almost like we were writing about ourselves, but from a third-party source. And so it was cited very heavily. And this we saw like 1 month after we launched, maybe 2 months after we launched. And so it happened very quickly, which I was really surprised by as well. And it wasn't a product-focused publication, but we did have certain content streams within it that were, somewhat product-related. So that, I think, was an interesting experiment in, sometimes you just have to ship something that you feel convicted about, and you may not know the extent of the impact that it will have. Like if we would have waited for a way to measure the impact of the sequence before we launched it, we probably never would have launched it. And so I think sometimes you just have to ship it and experiment and put something out there in the world and see what happens. And I do think the third-party external source, external domain part of it was a huge support when it came to the LLM optimization.
That's super interesting. And it tracks with what we're hearing right now, and what we're learning right now about this, as, things are becoming more and more clear, and, frameworks are starting to be established as people learn what works and what doesn't with regards to AEO. In terms of, if you were, I know you're, you just left Kanji, getting ready to take that next step. I don't know exactly what you have planned, or we haven't talked about it, but curious to hear. But if you were, rebuilding the sequence today, how do you think you might approach that a little bit differently? Are there certain things you'd want to do more of and certain things you'd want to do less of? Or do you think it's more of like all right, let's just take exactly this blueprint from what we did here and apply it to the new gig?
Yeah, I think the main thing that we did well that I would do again, but I would do a little differently, is we have this concept of anchors and distribution. So anchors were these like high quality source pieces of content that we would create that we would then repurpose into a like multitude of distribution assets. And so an example was we had the series, our most product focused one was a series called Demo Day, where we would literally just like demo different parts of the product. For some reason, people love that, by the way. Like, I don't know why Demo Day and like we're just doing a live demo was so interesting. I never would have guessed that, but maybe it's just in the world of, I don't know, AI and research, people are just looking for something really grounded. But we had these like series of anchors that we would then take that anchor, that demo day. We had our solutions engineers, which were very knowledgeable, that were giving that demo. And so we would take that asset, that recording, and then we could turn it into many, many different things. And that was a big focus for us, was that automation engine for the repurposing of the anchor. So we had this high quality anchor that was human, that was, there was a person that was presenting, that was telling a story. And then we would repurpose it in a lot of different ways. Another example of the anchor was our podcast. So we would do these podcast interviews, again, very human. I think the anchor has to be really human for this to work. And then where AI can come in is that distribution. The podcast episode could turn into like 30, 40 different assets, right? Social posts and write-ups and video clips and all that kind of stuff. And so I would definitely use that template again, but I would just start with less anchors. Like, we had a lot more resources, of course, there, but you could even start with one or two, and they don't have to be that complicated. I think we started with several anchors, but that slowed us down a little bit. You could easily start with just one or two. It could be a video series. It could be some sort of Q&A interview. It could be even just like a brainstorming session with some folks on your team or something like that. And then you could take that anchor and turn it into many different assets. But I think that's a good example of the parts of marketing where the human involvement and time is really important. And then there's other parts like that distribution process where AI can be super helpful without it losing its soul.
One of the things I've noticed you talk about a lot is manifestos, and writing in manifestos. I think I came across a post of yours recently where you said that was like the first thing you would do upon taking a new gig. Why do you think manifestos are so important? Like, why does every brand need one? And how do you push past some of the maybe negative feedback or negative association with that term? And also kind of work to develop something that's actually sharp and clear. Because I think that whenever you create a manifesto, or whenever you have this desire to create a manifesto, you also want to kind of get buy-in from a lot of people. But if you're too collaborative with it, it can kind of dilute the essence of what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's part of why I love the concept of the manifesto, because I think it really has to come primarily from the founder. Like, why did they create this? Why did they start this business? Like, the answer is in there somewhere. Like, there's some level of passion or pain that they wanted to solve, or some change they wanted to create in the world that allowed them to go through the enormous effort it takes to start a business, right? There is something there. And so I think I like the concept of the manifesto much more than starting with like a messaging document, because the messaging document requires all those inputs of approval. But something like a manifesto, which is just a reason for the company being, that's not something that necessarily requires a lot of consensus. Yes, of course, it needs to resonate with people, and it's good to get some input, especially from folks that are really close to your buyer and are going to know, if that resonates. But at the end of the day, it's something that is likely coming from the founder and is likely something that's not up for debate, if that makes sense. There's a reason why they started that company, and I think it's just important to write that down. And ultimately, it's, not something that's going to, be that consensus driving process that something like a messaging doc would be. And it's not something you ever have to publish either. It doesn't need to be public. It can be if you want it to. But I think that helps as well. It kind of takes a bit of the pressure off. It can really just be more of the North Star of the team. And then it can drive a lot of the messaging that's external, that's created. But it doesn't necessarily have to be something that everyone needs to sign off on every word.
Yeah, you're kind of signing off on it by working there, right? And I love that thinking. That really resonates with me a lot. We've done that kind of work in our Brand Heart program over the years, and it's such a wild card in the whole process, because it is kind of a foundation for that marketing and storytelling. But as you're touching on, it's not just for marketing, and it really shouldn't read like marketing speak either, and it is, yeah, one opportunity to just really make sure you're being honest and truthful about what the founder's excited about. And it's interesting how that I always see it as like a fork in the road, right? It's like, okay, now we have this articulated. By the way, that's like your internal culture and operations foundation. We're going down this marketing path with it now too. But I like that too, like taking the pressure off of it needing to be external facing, to just get it down and not be tempted to like jam pack in like value proposition type language into that.
Mm-hmm. Someone from product would be like, but you didn't mention this other feature we just shipped or whatever. Yeah, it takes the pressure off of that.
You've built teams through multiple stages, on the note of the manifesto, but really anything. What have you learned about creating alignment that survives the launch stage, but also lasts through execution and pivots and multiple iterations of the company?
Yeah, I'll give a specific example of a team structure I used a while back when that I think was really impactful to pr- created a level of ownership on the team that I had never seen before. And it's very simple. It was just this like squad formation. And I had a pretty flat team at the time. There wasn't multiple levels, right? And so I needed to create a scenario where there was just ownership, where folks really owned specific areas and they were driving the strategy and the execution of those. And I also realized that I felt like the team was moving very slow. And it was because marketing was this like production assembly line where it's like someone had a project and then they would hand it off to copy, and then they would hand it off to design, and then they would hand it off to this team to execute this bit and this bit. And then the whole thing would take 3 months to launch a campaign. And then it was just felt really, really slow and really disjointed. And so I put the team in this squad formation where each squad was self-sufficient. It had everyone in the squad who needed to be involved to ship that thing. And then it had a squad owner who was driving the weekly meeting. They were driving the ideas they brought to quarterly planning. They were driving the build of the Asana board for how we would execute it. They were really project managing, but they were also bringing like the strategy ideas to the table for quarterly planning. And I had someone on my team tell me a few months later, like, during that squad period where they were running that squad that they were in charge of, they were like, I just completely changed the way that I think about strategizing and, driving ownership and bringing ideas to the table. And so I think it created this sense of, you can do this with a pretty small team, even if you don't have the multiple levels. Like, you don't necessarily have to rely on the org chart to create that ownership. Folks can really drive that in a self-sufficient way on their own. And I think the real impact that it had was just that degree of, like, I'm in charge of this. I have a North Star. I have a goal that I set for myself. I have projects that I brought to the table. I have folks on the team that I'm in charge of making sure are going to execute this all the way to the finish line. And yeah, it was like a sense of accountability, but also a sense of like ownership and real like satisfaction I could see in the team when, they were able to succeed or ship that project. It was like, they could look back. It's almost like the way that the reason I joined companies early stage. I like to build something from nothing, and I like to look at something that I've created from nothing. And I think it kind of allowed them to have that same feeling.
Yeah, that's cool. You wrote this awesome post 4 or 5 months ago or so on, some of it was like the 9 lessons or 9 principles that you've learned being a 0 to 1 marketer. And I remember reading the post and seeing that it went pretty viral. I think you said you went for a run, you came back, and there's like tons of activity on it, and it kind of blew you away. Which of those 9 principles like resonates with you most today, and which one do you rely on most? And which one have you had experience with people maybe struggling with the most, and why?
It's funny that that post was kind of the first viral LinkedIn post I ever had. I think it got like 500,000 impressions, just absolutely blew up. And it's funny because I found that writing on LinkedIn or writing at all is just such a helpful way to crystallize your own principles. Like you get this benefit from doing it, from the need to write things down. And the one that I really tend to lead with and that feels most pertinent right now especially is knowing your customer so well that the strategy writes itself. And I think this is something that, especially with, like we talked about, so many folks obsessed with AI and automating everything that everyone's skipping over. I think if you know your customers so deeply and you have some knowledge of the toolbox of what you can do in marketing, of course, but if you know your customers so well, you know where they hang out, you know their challenges and their pain better than anyone, you know the way they like to consume content, you know what they're interested in, you know what they're missing. I think that writes your strategy. And I think that if you can start from that place, your strategy is going to feel so clear. And you don't necessarily need to have all the data in the world to know that you're doing the right thing, because you have this conviction that comes from the clarity of knowing the buyer so well. And I think a lot of times marketers, I'll share ideas with them or something, and they're always like, how did you measure that thing? Or like, what data can I bring to my, higher ups to pitch them on this idea? And data is great. But I feel like the times where I've pitched an idea that I'm so convicted about because I know the buyer so well and I can tell a really good story about the impact it's going to have, I find sometimes that's more compelling and helps with that getting buy-in from the org. Sometimes that's more impactful than the numbers. Like sometimes the numbers are great, don't get me wrong, but yeah, I find like knowing your buyer so well, it gives you this like purpose and conviction and clarity and helps you get the buy-in that you need for ideas that you know are going to work, even if the data is not perfect.
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah, it's an easy thing to get more consumed with what you want to say and what you want to offer than to be really in sync with and in touch with, like, even for the first part, like even just who your market is and making hard choices about that, but to actually talk to them and understand what they really need versus like how to pitch what you've built or what you want them to want and need. I'm curious with, you know, AI everywhere and, thinking about, you mentioned earlier the example of someone, oh, it helped us go from 2 to 5 blog posts, and you're asking why. Uh, what actually helps a brand today feel human instead of synthetic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the manifesto helps if there is like a source of fuel that's really driving the bigger picture about what you're writing about. I think having your content come from people, like it's published under someone's name, like a journalism site is published under a writer's name, I think that helps. I think if there's if you can open every piece of content with a personal story, I think that helps. And I try to practice this myself as I'm writing. And I read a lot of things these days where it's just, recommending best practices, or it's, providing a framework for something. But if it opened with a story of the why behind that thing that's personal, I think that's really what takes things to the next level. And another observation I've had recently is it feels like a lot of the content that's working really well out there right now is either incredibly polished or incredibly raw. Like it's like one or the other. It feels like the middle of the road is like kind of getting lost in the noise a little bit. But if it's incredibly raw, and that could mean it's like a walk and talk with my iPhone video, or, it could mean anything you want it to mean. It could be the way it's written. It could be the way it's produced, right? I think that stands out because of the human aspect of it. And then the incredibly polished, I think, has that level of like drama and seriousness, and like we really are betting on this and we're investing in this and we care about the experience, the production quality, et cetera. Like I think that's also really interesting, and I see that standing out right now. But yeah, the middle of the road stuff. And, I think what AI is really great at is like pattern recognition. It's great at taking like all the best writers in the world and like smashing them all together. But that's when you lose the quirks and you lose the edges and that's what it's built for. And so, of course, it's not great at writing, from scratch, because it's just like it's smashing together all the best writers. And then there's no personality to it really, because it's, trying to be everything to everyone.
That's good. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I was just reading something the other day about how ads with typos in them, like they outperform, and posts as well. Um, like the perfectly or like somewhat polished, more polished piece of content. Curious to understand, and we talked about AEO a little bit, but and you talked about wanting to work in more of a AI native environment at an early stage startup. When did you first realize that AEO was going to be a thing, and that it was going to change how brands not only create content, but how they discover content?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just from my own personal experience when I started using ChatGPT for absolutely everything. And in the beginning, you use it kind of like Google. And then as you get better at it, you use it more like a thought partner and you think a lot more about the context you're giving it and things like that. But yeah, I think it was really just that first, my own personal experience. Like, I'm using this to search, so like, I assume that everyone else is as well. And then it became obviously a very hot topic in the marketing community because there's a lot of people putting out their hot takes about how to optimize. And I was kind of reading those like, no one actually knows. Like, everyone's just making this up. And I think to some extent that's still the case because these models change so quickly. It's not like Google where like every year or two they have an update to the algorithm. It's like it's happening like every week something's changing. So I think we're going to have to really practice a culture of experimentation. And like we did with the sequence, just like shipping something and seeing, from a place of conviction and seeing how it works. Because I think if you're trying to like follow the best practices, then the best practices will be out of date in a couple months. So I think just that culture of experimentation and learning and constant curiosity is going to be more important than ever.
Yeah, nice. I like that approach. When when brands are now increasingly having to think of the first reader of that content as an LLM, uh, how do you think they need to shift their mindset on content if they're writing per maybe it's not an either or thing entirely, but and some, especially with a lot of emphasis on AEO, right? It's like, okay, we got to write for the machines. Maybe they're not thinking first about will people enjoy reading this as much. What do you think is the right mindset and balance there?
I've heard a lot of different methods of like the bulletin method and the Q&A method and ways to structure the content to make it more easily readable by LLMs. And I think that's totally valid. What if I take a step back, what I would do is just really consciously think about, am I writing for the LLMs or am I writing for a human? Because I think if you try to do both, like you're not gonna be great at either. In my experience, like again, the sequence was so impactful for LLM optimization, but that's not why we wrote it. And so if I had to pick one, I would write for the humans, and that would be my main focus. And then if the LLMs can read it, great. If not, great. If I try to optimize it for the LLMs and then the models change in a couple months, then I might have wasted my time. So I'd rather just write for the humans um, and then yeah, if the LLMs can read it, great. But I don't necessarily think try to hack the formatting of it is necessarily going to be a long-term strategy.
Yeah, we were just talking recently internally about how like content marketing nowadays is like it's humans and machines for humans and machines. That's basically like the in a nutshell version of what we're all trying to do right now. But yeah, I agree with your mentality that like the models are going to change, but if at the end of the day the people that eventually are meant to find their way to your content through these LLMs in a lot of cases don't really love what you have to say, like you're kind of missing the whole point, and you're not even marketing anymore. You're just kind of like trying to game the algorithm, right?
Yeah. And it could be something like an 80-20, like maybe 20% is for the LLMs to try to like check that box and, have the source material to give them the answers that they want or something like that. Could be a split there. It probably also depends on obviously where the content is going. If the content's living on your website, I'm sure, a nod to the LLMs is a good idea. Or if it's on that third-party site, a nod to the LLMs is a good idea. But if it's on social, where I think a lot of people are turning to for peer recommendations and, we can't like read books about what to do anymore because it's all changing too quickly. So I think a lot of folks are going to peers and to LinkedIn and places like that to learn. And so I think, of course, if the content's for social, then I think absolutely it should be for the humans.
Yeah, that's great. So I know we're not going to like release, or we're not going to announce your new role here. And so without naming any names and without talking explicitly about what you're going to do next, what kinds of problems or challenges are you excited about working on in your next role? And how are they pulling you into this next chapter?
Yeah, to sum it up, I really think it would be brand. And that's because I think brand, and actually I did a post about this today, how I think brand needs a rebrand because like it's such an eye roll word, right? And it sounds so expensive and mysterious. But I think in a world where creating software and writing code and building businesses is easier than ever, it feels like brand is really the biggest moat that you could possibly have. And so that's what my hyper main focus. And I had someone ask me yesterday, like, oh, are you more of an analytical marketer or more of a creative marketer? And historically, I was very analytical, data driven. All I cared about was the numbers and pipeline. But now I feel like I've flipped almost to the other side where it feels like the brand is more important than ever. And it needs to have like that soul and personality. And I think I've also grown as a marketing leader where it takes a lot of confidence to build brand because it's so squishy and based on taste. And you have to, feel convicted about something that's not necessarily backed up by numbers. But yeah, that's really the main focus for me because I think it's just the only moat that, you can really invest in right now. And one part of it that I'm really excited about is Emily Kramer calls this ecosystem marketing, but it's just the idea of activating your community. I think community marketing is going to be more important than ever. I think a lot of people are, turning to community to educate themselves and connect. And so I think that's something that I'm really excited about, whether it's partners or users or even your own team to some extent, like really activating the people. And, is there a way to turn that into a part of the flywheel of the brand?
Yeah, I love where your head's at. I mean, we had on Drew Neiser a couple weeks ago from CMO Huddles, and he was talking about how like CMOs need to get away from using the term brand as well, like especially with regards to like when they collaborate with CFOs, COOs, and even CEOs in some cases, because it just invites a lot of unnecessary scrutiny. Whereas if you just refer to the work you're doing as campaigns and reputation building, it doesn't have that same like knee-jerk reaction of other analytical people asking you like, hey, well, how are we going to measure that? Like you can measure a campaign, right? But you can't necessarily, without like a bunch of proxy numbers and metrics, really get a sense of how your brand is performing. It's cool. What's interesting too is like I've heard a lot of people say that too, like that have been a little bit more analytical, that they're coming more over to like the brand side of things because they understand the moat opportunity. I mean, that's the whole point of this podcast and the name. That's the basis behind the name of Best Story Wins. Like we believe that brand is a story that people tell about your company, and ultimately at the end of the day, the best story is the one that wins. So. Yeah, I love where your head's at there. I know we're close to time, but for people that want to learn more about you, where's the best place for them to find you online and connect with you online?
Yeah, definitely LinkedIn. I have just, really loved just the connections community that I've built and am building on LinkedIn. I also just launched my newsletter, which is called the 0 to 1 Marketer, very on brand for me. And that's really a place where I want to go deeper in just sharing a lot of the stories, because it's been a ride the last decade or so. And so I have a lot of stories to tell. And so that's definitely a good place, for folks that want to just like, hear the experiences, hear the hard lessons learned, all the hard way. That's the best place to go deep on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is great.
Thank you.